unfortunately, and there's very little control we've had over these issues. But we're still trying to give you the best possible festival, and I hope the facilities will improve as the day goes ahead, and the people, get into the act, as it were. So today, this should have been 2 panels, in fact, and I was going to do a one-on-one with Steve Coll, and we've had to squeeze in about 3 panels into this one panel. So I hope you'll bear with us. My name is Ahmed Rashid. I'm one of the organizers of the festival. Let me now very briefly introduce to you a very diverse, fascinating panel. On my right, former President Roza. She is a political star of Central Asia, the first foreign minister, the first woman ambassador. Hello. She was the first woman ambassador, the first woman foreign minister, and she eventually became president, and is the only president on record in Central Asia to have stepped down voluntarily when her time was up. We in Pakistan know all about people refusing to step down when their time is up. So it's a great relief to met someone in her. She's a symbol of modernism and democracy, and Kyrgyzstan is on its way to becoming a beacon of light in the region. We have our own star, Hina, who of course was the first Pakistani woman foreign minister. She's been finance minister, foreign minister. She served in several governments, and she's generally is known for her quick response to any question that she does. He's a Swedish-Pakistani writer and author with publications that include The Hunt for the Swedish Character. And in fact, he spent a lot of his life looking for the Swedish character. I think that is marvelous, a Pakistani looking for the Swedish character. But that's what he's dedicated himself to. He was also Chief Secretary of the Integration Policy Committee of the Swedish government, and has worked in various capacities at the government. We have Italian journalist Viviana Mazza, who reports for Corriere della Sera around the world. She's covered many issues, but most especially women's issues, and she has won numerous awards for her journalism. Now, last, but because of the time and energy he has spent in Pakistan, trying to understand Pakistan, I must say very fairly, and trying to explain Pakistan to outside readers. So he has an illustrious record. He's won the Pulitzer twice. He has been managing editor of the Washington Post. He's headed a think tank in Washington. And he now is occupying what is perhaps the most prestigious position in American journalism as Dean of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He wrote a best-selling book called Ghost Wars, and that is when I first met him in the 80s, when the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. And we are all waiting for his second Ghost Wars book, and we hope it comes soon. Thank you all very much for coming. Well, we have a whole a vast road. Roza, we're talking about contemporary Great Games. It seems that the whole map of Central Asia is changing very fast. We've got the retreat of the United States, we've got the, if you like, the forced retreat of Russia, and we've got the entry into China. How is this being, we have our own views as to how we see this, but how is it being seen in Central Asia itself? And are you worried about the overwhelming presence of China?
First of all, I want to thank you, Lahore Festival, inviting us to be at such a wonderful, rich, intellectually very rich event. not only, we have another fellow from Uzbekistan, but we are really very rare guests at the talks in South Asia, and next door to our countries is Pakistan, and we rarely communicate to each other. So that's why I'm so happy to be here and to learn about this region, about this country. Central Asia is a new actor in the world politics, and this year we'll celebrate each of us quarter of a century of our independence. It's not so long. Look at your history back, how you looked 25 years old. So today is a very challenging world. I do remember when Soviet Union was collapsing and we entered to this global politics. It was really serious troubles we had in front of us to get a new skin, to learn how to balance, how to live, how to survive, and so on. So today, Central Asia is 5 countries, very attractive on the Silk Road because of our natural resources, mineral resources, and because of our human resources also. About 60 million we have today altogether in 5 countries. Very pity that we do not have communication. I came to Lahore first time. I've been a couple of times in Pakistan, but what a rich culture, what a rich such a environment intellectually. So from Bishkek to Delhi, we have today direct flight, which is 3 hours flight, but not to Pakistan and to Islamabad or Karachi. Yes, in Central Asia today we have the picture that China is there. What is no China? Tell me, China is throughout the globe, in all the countries, especially promising in Central Asia. We have concluded with China billions amounts of projects, and the main one, it is transport communication. We want to revive the Silk Road, and I'm learning now about Sino-Pak agreement also, how it will go. It will exactly start from Kazakhstan, will go via Kyrgyzstan and cross Torvar Pass via Karakorum Chaussee, via China, I mean, and then it will come to your ports. We dream that this route will be implemented. But Russia withdraw not, Ahmed, Russia is there. We got the part of the Euro-Asian Economical Alliance, which aims 170 million people. And withdraw for the United States. I don't think so. We became over the 25 years such an ally also to this country. We got in time a lot of assistance from this country. We value this, and I do hope that we'll learn in this troubling world about the art of living in globalized world. So Central Asia is in move. Central Asia is trying to build new routes and communications. And I do hope that the most important it is, of course, matter of security, matter of balances of interest in the region.
Steve, I mean, there's a perception. Thank you. Steve, there's a perception here in the region that the US is walking away from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and I just come from Central Asia. There's a perception in Central Asia also that the Americans are walking away from this entire region. Now, I mean, obviously you have elections, we don't know what's going to happen in the American elections, but whatever happens, I mean, is there, you think, a very strong feeling in the American establishment, in the military, in the State Department, whoever comes in, that this area is really not important anymore?
No, I don't think so. I think that there's kind of a conversation about how to reset American relations in the region and to make them more sustainable and more successful. successful, more. Is that better? Yeah. So I think there's a conversation about how to reset American relations in this part of the world so that they're more sustainable and more successful than they have been over the last 10 years. And that's really already underway in Pakistan. In Afghanistan, obviously the question is really not American policy, but the political future of Afghanistan and whether the country is going to descend into another round of terrible civil conflict, and in what form. But I think, at the Pentagon, firstly, it's a little bit like Pakistan. When you talk about the American government, we have about 5 or 6 governments. And even within the Pentagon, we have the outlook of Central Command, which is the part of the military that deals with Pakistan. And it has one set of attitudes. And then you have Pacific Command, which is the part of the Pentagon that deals with India. And it has a different set of attitudes about the region. But certainly within Central Command, there's a continuity of interest in maintaining ties, contacts, supply relationships, stability, but with a lower footprint. The era of expeditionary counterinsurgency wars, I think, is thankfully over in the United States, at least for a generation. And so I think that's the sort of framework. As to sort of China's place in the picture, look, the U.S., like India, and Europe, to some extent, I think is fairly clear about what they're trying to accomplish strategically with China, which is to engage, invite, and encourage China into as a full partner in the international system, and at the same time hedge against the possibility that Chinese ambitions would be incompatible with American interests, or in the case of India or Europe, their interests. So engage, but hedge. And in that sense, I think from the U.S. perspective, the historical post-war allies in the Pacific, Japan, Philippines, Singapore, new partners like Vietnam, are probably a greater priority for the United States in its hedging strategy than, say, Pakistan or Central Asia. The idea that China wants to develop economic and political relations in this part of the world that are stabilizing, that's actually compatible with the U.S. vision of where things are going. And just one last comment at the risk of being facetious, but in Afghanistan, we've been having this same discussion in your house since the 1980s. It hasn't changed a whole lot in the 25 years, but when the Americans went barreling into Afghanistan after September 11th, I think the kind of Russian attitude was, well, good luck with that. And there's a sort of sense as the Americans withdraw from this, sort of bitter experience over the last 10 years, and they watch China sort of moving into it, some skepticism that any outside global power can really influence these crowded, complex societies in the way that their leaders think that they can.
Hina, can I ask you about China and the expectations in Pakistan? Somehow we seem to have elevated this whole promise of Chinese money to be some sort of magical mystery tour whereby it will save Pakistan and rescue Pakistan, and we don't have to do anything ourselves. We just have to wait for this money to land up, and the whole geopolitics of this region will change. Give us a better sense of reality. I mean, where do the Chinese stand in relation to Pakistan? What are their expectations from dishing out all this money? What would they like to see in Afghanistan?
First of all, Ahmed, I think it's interesting. First of all, let me just say I have to make this one comment that Steve is absolutely right in saying that if there's a country which comes closest to Pakistan and how the military sort of plays, interesting roles, it's certainly the United States of America and not any other European country. But interestingly, I think the role of China in the world today, certainly in a country like Pakistan, depends on whose angle are you looking at it from. I'm surprised when I go to international forums where many of the European countries and sort of the intelligentsia from within and many of the American intelligentsia, etc., are really worried about what they call Chinese economic imperialism. Right? Now in Pakistan, obviously we view it very, very differently. We might view it as largesse, but it is all as a benefactor, as somebody who's creating opportunities where they do not exist. And coming in Central Asia, as statistics will prove, China has had much more economic interventions than in Pakistan. But in Pakistan, because I'm going to answer the first question, I think it's very important. In Pakistan, we have overblown the proportion or put too much at the... China is an extremely important partner to Pakistan, strategically, politically, economically, no doubt about it. But to let your own exports sort of falter away and decrease by 14% and not worry about your own industry and really back and put all your eggs in one basket, and imagine that the Chinese sort of economic interventions is all that is going to save Pakistan is obviously not the right strategy, which is an important part of Pakistan's strategy to go forward, but certainly not in the one. Certainly not the isolated one. Now, I just want to also talk about the larger topic, right? Because I think, from where Steve left, I would like to pick up from there. Because contemporary great games, as what we're supposed to be talking about, is so fascinating, right? Because it would seem today, what is happening in Syria, Libya, etc., that the games are being played in that region, and that region is maybe Mackinder's heartland theory of, the determinant of who will rule the world. I believe otherwise. And I think, maybe I would like to believe Steve sort of pointed out in that the real contemporary great game is being played in and reflected, or in what Secretary Clinton called the Asian pivot back in early 2000s or after 2010, in 2010, in the Asia Society. And that Asian pivot is more inclined towards the South China Sea and the Southeast Asian powers over there than what we consider to be Central Asia. Central Asia is redefining itself in every which way. The boundaries may also be redefined in the Middle East that we know today. But to some people, that is just correction of history. Those boundaries which are incorrectly demarcated by imperial powers post-World Wars are now going to possibly be corrected, or maybe not. So that's another thing. That's the war theater being shifted. But the contemporary great game, if you take the Connolly definition of great game, is certainly what is being played in the South China Sea area and all the allies around it. And interestingly, one last point on that. The big new player in the contemporary great game, possibly not in the South China Sea area, but certainly in the Middle East, whatever is happening, is the overwhelming role and power of the non-state actor, which is not in the old great games. So in the old great games, non-state actors might have been used to serve state interests, but today, in today's world, the non-state actors will play a role which will possibly be larger than many, many important states. And to end with, maybe, what, I believe it's Paul Breton of the Yale University who calls, the real challenge in Asia, or, the South China Sea area and the, Southeast Asia area, where this contemporary great game is being played, is to ensure that the situation remains asymmetric. I'm just using my own words to define what you defined, but the situation remains asymmetric in the sense that the real military power, or the biggest military power in Asia, remains a North Asian, which we can all guess who that is, right? So the fear of China is actually being looked into through a microscope, and therefore that fear is being exaggerated to a limit where none of the good, for instance, AIIB Bank with $100 billion capital, it's great for every country. You're building roads. How can building roads and building infrastructure and building ports? It can be good for everyone only. It can only have a good value. It cannot be a harmful value. But if the concern is to inhibit somebody else's power, or what they call economic imperialism, then obviously the great games start.
Viviana, can I ask you, I mean 2 points that Hina raised. One is this whole role of non-state actors, which is now hitting Europe very badly. Now you had this attack in France, and suspicion there could be more attacks in Europe, and at the same time you're faced with a migrant crisis. More than 1 million migrants last year, probably another 1 million this year, countries shutting down their borders. is Europe going to shut itself up and shut itself off from the rest of the world? And, you know, I mean, this is very much part of the contemporary great game, because a lot of people from Central Asia, from the Middle East, from Pakistan, Afghanistan, they're trying to escape into Europe. What is going to be the attitude? And there seems to be a very big fight going on in Europe right now between the right and the left, between wanting migrants to come in and trying to block migrants. Where is this going to lead us?
Okay. So I usually, I'm a journalist for Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. I usually ask the questions, so you have to forgive me if my way of answering will not be, you know, satisfactory. But I can tell you, you know, these are the two biggest issues right now. You know, the terrorism issue and the migrant issue are really felt by people who don't read newspapers, people who don't, and they don't necessarily go to newspapers to understand. And when they do, sometimes I feel that we have a huge responsibility right now. Okay, so on one hand, we have political parties on the right. You know, in the US, we are seeing the same thing, but in Europe, we've seen it with Le Pen in France, for instance. They are legitimizing themselves based on the idea that terrorism and migrants, they all belong together. It's just one huge problem. It's the same problem, the same thing. And the lack of analysis and the lack of explanations and the ability to see the complexities and the differences is what is feeding them as well. There is a lot of fear, you know, fear of migrants, and the word migrants and refugees are often confused with each other. I work as a foreign affairs journalist, but I also write books for teenagers. And they are books about the same. I've written a book about Pakistan. Now the next one is about Nigeria. And there are books about realities in these countries. But when I go to a lot of schools, dozens of schools every year, and the kids ask me questions like, so are the terrorists coming by boat? Are they coming from Libya? What is the danger? They ask you about ISIS, and you know, when they're 9-year-olds, and they don't know what to make out of it. So, is Europe going to shut itself up? Sometimes when I go to talk with, I went to like clubs where, you know, kind of like Rotary or, you know, Lions and this type of clubs, and sometimes I feel that people want to think of this as an emergency, something that is going to end. The word emergency is also used a lot in newspapers. This is not an emergency. This is something that is there to stay. And Europe, we've had Angela Merkel, who tried to offer, you know, a different approach. Like, we have a duty to welcome people, but politically she's been hurt by this. And recently, France, you know, the Prime Minister of France, Valls, he mentioned that. He said somebody wanted to give her the Nobel Peace Prize, but now I see what the consequences are of her politics. So. Europe is having a hard time, and is, you know, to find a united front with this. And this is a huge test for Europe. You know, the Europe we will have will be the Europe that proves or doesn't prove able to agree on this. Italy has been on the forefront of this for a long time because of, you know, its coastlines, and it's pushed for a European approach. But we have many divisions, and you know, we managed to agree on quotas, but then, you know, these quotas are just a small part of the phenomenon, the huge phenomenon. So, you know, this is one problem. The other one is the terrorist problem, and the attacks in Paris. I think they have shaken people, you know, even teenagers, you know, because of the nature of the attacks. And I know that in this region, and you know, things like this happened. But you know, and sometimes there was the whole debate: why do you feel so bad about Paris and not about Beirut, or you know? And I think it is, unfortunately, you know, it is a global world, but it's also very. It's a world where you can feel stronger for the people who are closer to you, in a way. And I just want to say, I think, as a journalist, like I look at it as a journalist and what we're doing, and sometimes I think there is a lot of confusion regarding these two terms, migrants and refugees. There was a huge debate in the newspapers in Europe at some point. Shall we call them migrants? Shall we call them refugees? And newspapers chose different, made different choices. The Financial Times said we should call them migrants because it kind of covers everybody, and people apply for asylum, but they're not necessarily going to recognize it, be recognized. And other newspapers like The Guardian said, no, we should call them refugees, it's our duty, it's our moral. And this reflects the same thing that is going on in people's heads. And sometimes this is also a reflection of a problem, that there are no ways of regularizing yourself. In Italy, it's very hard if you are a migrant, so everybody asks for asylum, and there's this, and this confuses people as well. And so, I mean, I'm just going to close here.
Qaisar, let me, you've done a lot of work on integration of presumably Pakistanis into Sweden. What are your, there are Swedish Pakistanis who are joining ISIS, who are going to the Middle East, who are part of this whole propaganda blitz about Islam and Islamic extremism and all the rest of it. How are you seeing the reaction? Why is this happening in a country like Sweden, where the Pakistanis are very well integrated and they speak the language and all the rest of it?
To be honest, I don't think that it's mainly concerns Pakistanis or is even isolated to that. The thing is that Europe is actually in a state of trauma, right? Because, as Vivian stressed, Europe's self-image, it's hurt. Because, globalization and migration, it's completely changed, not just the political or the financial scene, but also the demographic scene. Because most of the European countries, especially in the northerns, they have during 100 and 150 years, managed to create a sense of being a homogeneous society, where everyone looks the same, thinks the same, reacts the same. And what globalization and migration has done is that this narrative of being homogeneous, it's being disturbed. When you, for example, presented me, you said it's interesting that a Pakistani guy is trying to find the Swedish character. But that's just the thing, that in our world, and that's clear in the European context, what Pakistanis or a Swedish or a Norwegian, that's not the same thing as it was for, let's say, 20 years ago. Today a Swede can look like this. A Swede can celebrate Eid, for example. And I think that has made it difficult for a lot of people, not only migrants, but also for original Swedes, to actually understand and grasp what's happening in the society. And they're reacting in different ways. People who have blonde hair, they often join the right movement. People who look like me, they often try to find their solution or their question of who they are by turning them to ISIS or other extremist organization. And you could see at the terror bombing in France or in England that most of these acts, they're not done by people who are coming from other countries. They are done by people who are actually born and raised there. And one key answer is that they don't find a place for them in the society, because they don't feel like Pakistanis or Iranis or Turkey or Arab, but they still don't feel like being French or Swedish or whatever, and that creates a trauma on an individual level.
Roza, Hina raised this whole issue of the ground is shifting. The ground is also shifting in Central Asia. For the first time, we have 700 or 800 Uzbeks and Qaisar and Tajik and Kyrgyz fighting for ISIS in Syria. Why is this phenomenon happening? Central Asia has been so isolated from Islamic movements, from political movements, and yet, it's one of the biggest contingents of foreign fighters for ISIS in Syria and Iraq are Central Asian?
Actually, I'm fascinated with the weight of this discourse, contemporary games, and I would pick up of Hina regarding the role of non-governmental actors. All of us, we have passed this collapse of the socialist system and withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan. How much worry was in those days? You remember well, Ahmed and you, Steve, right? That was really such a difficult time. Today, we are on the height of another wave, which is Syria, Libya, others, and in the Afghan war also, we had, of course, Soviet soldiers, Central Asian being Soviet soldiers, but at the same time, there are a lot of people also from Central Asia fighting on Afghan side. Today, we have, unfortunately, as you said, thousands and thousands of people recruited to Syria, not just the men, but the women also. This is a striking fact for us. But I just came from the section from Mazza to madrasa or other way, and they are talking about the identity of Pakistan, how it's happened that you sort of you allowed for Islam to have such a dominance in some way. This is exactly going on in our part of the world, in Central Asia. I would say that Islam came to completely empty place. I mean, in the sense that the governments practiced very strict atheism and secularism, and still some governments they dictate that sort of rule of law in our countries. But non-governmental actors are very strong. They are very mobile. They build so far as much as we have schools, for example, in my country, more than 2,000. We have the same amount of mosques, but we have finished Soviet days with 100 mosques. Would you imagine the altitude? So this is really something going on serious. It's like a landslide. And people do believe to all sorts of such flows of Islam that it should be jihad, it should be a sort of caliphate built one day and so on. I'm talking to you and appealing as post-communist political animal. I mean, I'm almost non-believer in some way, but we are a bit in dismay how to handle this situation. It is not easy. And if you, after 70 years, you have this discussion about your identity, madrasas are so important, they are on the height of their power and so on. I do hope that we'll handle this much better and on time, because we faced, yes, economically, China coming with all these projects and building the roads and interconnection between all our countries and within the subcontinent. But on the power of, let's say, on the soft power side, we are in not an easy situation. If you handle very strong, as in communist time, I think the end will be again unpredictable. So I think this is our challenging future. These are challenging questions which we face.
Let me engage Hina and Steve in a discussion about our identity. Is the crisis that we are facing is not only the ground shifting under Pakistani's feet, but the fact that after so many decades we have still not been able to acquire an identity, or we have different identities. We have a modernist identity and we have a mullahist identity. Hina.
Okay, you're putting me in a difficult spot because I hate to be viewed as a pessimist. And the reason he gave for that was that he wanted for his citizens in Afghanistan to understand what history his country had gone through. And his words were that until we learn what has happened to us, we will not be able to break the cycle. So in other words, we will not be able to learn our lessons from history. So many a times, people view you to be, or any one of us to be too pessimistic on Pakistan when we point out the faults in Pakistan, right? In my view, one of the biggest mistakes that Pakistan has been, and therefore I, in some ways smirk when I see other countries following Pakistan's example in sometimes Bangladesh, in sometimes India, in sometimes Central Asian republics, as if we've achieved a great deal. We have 2 decades of lost opportunities on account of how we try to define our identity as one which is antagonistic to another. And identity cannot be one which is against someone else. It has to be defined as superior within itself. The supremacy has to be found. Now, interestingly, I truly believe, and I'm not saying it because I want to be viewed as optimistic by my fellow Pakistanis, I truly believe that Pakistan is now getting on the right trajectory, that we are trying to break away from those decades of, building hostility, using, religion as opium for the masses. We have done a fantastic job. We are a test case of that. So whenever any other country, such as Bangladesh, such as sometimes India, want to try and follow our example, please look at how we lost opportunities rather than gained. So Pakistan is a great test case. What not to do in that time. And hopefully now in the next 20 years, what to do.
Steve,
Well,
you've lived in this country for so long. I mean, you know us as well as we do.
I think my reputation is the American who's the most optimistic about Pakistan. I still feel that way. I mean, I think it's not a question of a lack of identity. It's a struggle among. It's not a question of the absence of identity. It's a struggle among identities, and we have the same struggle in the United States in important ways. But the thing that I think my Pakistani friends sometimes take for granted, despite the terrible losses of the last 20 years, personal losses and tragic setbacks for Pakistan's national potential by the loss of diverse, pluralistic leadership that was modernizing, that had a vision for Pakistan's modernization within the founding ideas that brought the state together in the first place. But what I sometimes think my Pakistani friends underestimate is how powerful Pakistani nationalism has become. Above all, if you, I come from a very nationalistic country, and we wave a lot of flags, we sing a lot of songs, and boy, it's really hard to break the resilience of American identity under pressure, even though the country is very diverse and often in violent argument with itself. But when I travel around the world, I find very few other states where nationalism is as strong as it is in the United States, and Pakistan is one of them. And that has happened under pressure. It's happened through crisis, and it's now unbreakable. So, yes, you can see it, in sport. You can see it in lots of different venues. But it's actually, in the world we're in, it could be a source of strength if the struggle within leads to a restoration of the tolerance, pluralism, the vision of modernization that was present at the beginning and was represented despite all the failures and all of the bad governments by many sort of leading figures in Pakistan history. So I think there is a great foundation. I think Pakistan's in a good neighborhood. It has a lot of goodwill around it. And so I fully expect that the struggle will turn out well. And I would just say, even more recently, having come back and forth and lived through these last, whatever it's been now, 15 years since 2001, I mean, it's disruptive to change venues for this festival, but here we are. We're here together. And, it was only 7 years ago that it was 2009, and that was a dark bottom of a cycle. And 2010 and 2011 weren't great years either. But the struggle is going on, and I think the right side is winning, and that over time over the next 10 years, there's an opportunity to return to the kind of aspiration that Pakistan has displayed at its best. And so I think this festival represents that. That's why I came.
Would you, I mean, just briefly, 2 minutes each, both of you. Is European identity being eroded? And what is going to replace this erosion? Is the fact that we've got such polarization in Europe now between the right and the left, and the fact that many of the right accuses immigrants of changing national identity. What is going to happen to this whole identity issue in Europe?
I want to talk as an Italian because every country is a bit different, and in Italy there is a huge problem that even Italians who are like sons and daughters of immigrants who are born in Italy, they're not considered Italians by some Italians, who are not children, firstborn children of, second generation immigrants. And this is because Italy, as we were saying earlier, is one of those countries that still sees itself as an homogeneous society. This is changing now. This is going to change now. And this is very difficult to accept for people. This is beyond left and right, I think. Of course, the right is using this, and the extreme right is using this. What happened in France was very interesting. In the last elections, everybody was so scared Marine Le Pen was going to take over. She was in the provincial elections, take over one of the provinces, which never happened. The Front National never did that. And the socialists and the right, the Sarkozy party, the right-wing party, they invoked the alliance that was invoked in the past to avoid the extreme right from taking power, and it worked mostly. And so they ended up not managing to get even one province. Was it defeated? No, because this is more than a party. This is it's an identity problem. It's going to continue, and it's going to be hard, but Europe is going to change completely, and we will leave this, and hopefully it won't be violent, and hopefully it will be, managed, which is not easy to manage.
I'm really optimistic. I think that not even just Sweden, but Europe and the world will adapt to how we perceive the national identities. Because I read somewhere that there are 3 questions that all philosophers and religious people have tried to answer. And these are, where do I or we come from? What are we now? And what is a group? And the thing is that the answer to the not just European, but as well as Pakistani identities or all national identities in the world, it's been the idea of having same ethnicity or having same religion. And that idea, narrative, that's being challenged by the globalization. And I think that's why we're having these right-wing movements and people turning to ISIS or whatever. But I'm optimistic. I think it will take some time, and we will discuss and maybe fight a bit, and then we will find a new way of defining ourselves.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm sorry we have to cut this short, but you can hear more of Steve Coll. He's got another panel tomorrow, I think. Today. And you can definitely hear a one-on-one between Roza and Fazana Sheikh, who will be interviewing Roza about her life, her whole life cycle from being a member of the Communist Party to becoming president of a democratic Kyrgyzstan, which I think will be very fascinating. And I'd like to thank all of you, Hina, especially for making this effort, Qaisar, Viviana, thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry there was no room for questions, but the audio system, I don't think, can take questions from the audience. And I hope later in the day this will improve. Thank you very much indeed.